Hi, I'm Sopot and this is Loading Patch. Have you ever wondered why Sony uses these symbols while both Nintendo and Microsoft use ABXY for their button labels, but in different locations, resulting in some truly weird situations? Button labels used to be direct, no guessing required. Games were a lot simpler and they were usually tied to a specific hardware, so each action could be allocated its own button. You want to jump? Press the jump button. As games became more advanced, alongside the introduction of home consoles with interchangeable games, arose a need for a universal controller label that can be used with any games. Some controllers had their own labels like Fire 1 and Fire 2 on the Atari, or simple numbers like 1, 2, 3, and so on. But the NES was the first to introduce the abstract labeling of B and A. If you've ever seen this controller, you've probably wondered why the button labels are in reverse. There are two theories.
The first theory is that they're actually not backwards. Japan is unique for having two writing systems. The first one is the one we're all familiar with, writing horizontally from left to right. This is called yokogaki. The second system is called tategaki, writing vertically right to left. This is commonly found in newspapers and books, hence why Japanese books appear flipped.
The second theory is of ergonomics and importance. The right button on the NES controller is the natural resting place for your thumb. It's the most accessible position, so it was given the role of a primary button A. And the left button, tucked away towards the middle, became the secondary button B.
With games and consoles continuing to evolve, controllers needed more buttons. With Nintendo's next console, SNES, they added the X and Y buttons, creating the ABXY we know today. B and A were relocated to be slanted to fit the natural movement of the thumb, and that design choice can be seen in Nintendo's other devices like the Game Boy. X and Y were placed further away from your thumb as they are considered secondary buttons. According to Nintendo, the letters were chosen as they were commonly used in CAD design and engineering. So even though other letters could have been used, such as A, B, C, D, the first four letters of the alphabet, or A, B, Y, Z, the first and last two letters of the alphabet, ABXY was chosen as it was deemed most fitting.
Wait, so SNES was released in 1990 and the Xbox was released in 2001. Why did Microsoft mix it up? Well, it wasn't their doing. Microsoft merely borrowed the layout from another company. Let's talk about Sega.
Sega SG-1000 is a line of Japan-exclusive consoles that came out around when Famicom, the original name for NES, was released. It features an old-school stick and button controller reminiscent of Atari controllers, but with the success of the NES, Sega launched a Mark II version of the console featuring a controller that took heavy inspiration from Nintendo. In 1985, the same year NES was released in the US, Sega remodeled the Mark III, the third iteration of SG-1000, and released it in the US as Sega Master System. Both Nintendo and Sega remodeled the console and controller for overseas, but unlike Nintendo, who kept the same labeling, Sega changed it from no labels at all to numbers going left to right. This was a console made for the rest of the world, and it made sense to label it as such. When it was time to release their next console, Sega too needed more buttons for their console Mega Drive, also known as Genesis. They initially released the 3-button controller featuring A, B, C going left to right, just like the Master System. But this wasn't enough, especially when compared to the SNES controller, which features 4 buttons alongside 2 shoulder buttons. So the 6-button controller was released featuring X, Y, and Z on top of the existing buttons. This was perfect for complex games and arcade ports. Sega would iterate on their 6-button controller with their next console, Sega Saturn. In 1998, Sega dropped C and Z buttons and created the alternative ABXY for the Dreamcast, their lost console. This layout was adopted by Microsoft, and it continues to live on Xbox and numerous PC controllers.
The new or the alternative ABXY wasn't a lazy attempt at a copy. It took inspiration from the NES controller and evolved in its own unique way. Microsoft didn't just take the ABXY from Sega either. Microsoft was a key partner providing Windows CE, a custom operating system for Sega Dreamcast. Hence, why many view the original Xbox as a spiritual successor to the Dreamcast. It's not clear whether Microsoft and Sega had a deal to allow Xbox to use this layout, but it didn't matter as Sega exited the console market and Microsoft swooped in at the right time. But it's undeniable they took heavy inspiration from Sega, as even the prototype controller from the 2000s borrowed heavily from Sega's 6-button controller.
While Nintendo, Sega, and Microsoft were fumbling around with alphabets, Sony was sitting quietly in the corner as their plot for revenge was taking shape. Sony had a deal with Nintendo to create a CD add-on and a hybrid console for the SNES. The deal fell out, which resulted in perhaps the biggest blunder in video game history: Nintendo accidentally creating their biggest competitor. As PlayStation started out as a variant of SNES, the PlayStation controller features a striking resemblance to the SNES controller. Rather than using numbers or alphabets, Sony engineer Teiyu Goto chose shapes with clear intent. The circle represents yes, the X or cross represents no, the square, shaped like a piece of paper, represents the menu, and the triangle symbolizes a point of view. The circle and cross buttons were placed to match the location of B and A buttons on the SNES controller, a choice that likely stems from its origin.
It's interesting how Nintendo's position as a market leader influenced both Sony and Microsoft's button layout. But when we look at third-party games now, Nintendo's button layout is considered a second-class citizen. Some games on the Nintendo console ignore the golden rule: A as confirm and B as back. While it doesn't help that there's another similar ABXY layout, that doesn't paint the whole picture. To understand how we got to this point, we need to talk about Sony.
Here's a question: which one of these ABXY is from Nintendo? If you guessed it's the one on the left, you'd be correct. According to Sony, if what you see on screen looks normal, you are from Western countries.
Sony made a controversial localization choice when bringing their PlayStation to the world. They swapped the roles of circle and X for Western countries, as each region interprets them slightly different. Both regions use circle as correct and X as wrong. This is apparent when you look at game shows. However, Western culture also uses X to mark. Think of a treasure map or a checkbox. Since video games were region-locked, this didn't cause any problems. That was until the 7th generation consoles were released.
This generation saw a major shift in the video game industry. Japanese developers, who have been the dominant creative force in the industry, started to lag behind Western developers. It's not that Japanese developers forgot how to make great games. This is a simple matter of numbers. There are more people working from multiple Western countries than a single country of Japan. More people equals more ideas. We also saw an increase in complexity as video games moved away from standard definition and into HD. Games became more expensive to develop, which meant it was a risk to stick to one console. This was also the era where game engines such as Unity and Unreal became the standard. Rather than creating a proprietary engine in-house, developers could utilize a versatile game engine built for multiple platforms. This ensured game developed for one platform could be ported to another with less friction. 7th generation is the era where each company solidified their place in the video game industry. Sony and Microsoft both stayed at the struggle for the most powerful consoles, whilst Nintendo stepped back and started to focus more on unique playing experience. Nintendo Wii was essentially a beefed up version of Nintendo's previous console, the GameCube. While the console did not make the jump to HD, it offered a unique motion control experience that enticed gamers, selling over 100 million units. Their strategy that allowed this massive sale also came at a cost. This was the era of multi-platform release, and Nintendo Wii's console and controller were too different from the competitors. The default Wii controller no longer featured the ABXY Nintendo created. It features a D-pad, a trigger, and 3 face buttons labeled 1, 2, and A. The weaker horsepower of the console didn't help the matter at all. So even though the Wii ended up selling more units than the competitors, it was abandoned by third-party devs. So Western developers focused on Xbox 360 and PS3. Coincidentally, the Western PlayStation button principle perfectly matched the location of Xbox ABXY. Two similarly powered consoles that share similar button layout? This was a perfect match. Iconic video game franchises were born during this generation. Titles like Assassin's Creed, Call of Duty, BioShock, Dead Space, Gears of War, Uncharted all came out during this generation, all using the bottom button, X or A, as confirmed. This caused some headaches for developers remapping the control for Nintendo's ABXY. Do you match the label or location? Matching the location creates a disconnect between games made for Nintendo console first and third-party multi-platform games. Matching the label offers the best experience for Nintendo gamers, but conflicts with muscle memory for gamers who own multiple consoles. No matter which choice developers make, anyone who plays Nintendo consoles and other platforms have to deal with this disconnect every time they switch between. But at least it's happening when you switch to different consoles. PS4 and PS5, due to the removal of region locking, exposed just how messy and fragmented these control schemes actually were. Sometimes, you have to buy a game from a different region, as some games and translation can be region exclusive. The mismatch of regions of console and game require players to switch their button layout when navigating the game. To select the game and play, press X. To select anything inside the game, press circle. If you need to navigate the console in the middle of the playthrough, remember to switch to the X button. Sometimes, the game throws you a curveball with this save file screen that Sony provides that looks just like the PlayStation OS. It visually tricks you to press X to confirm, but in fact, you have to press circle.
Starting with PS5, Sony finally started to unify the control scheme by adapting the Western layout worldwide, ending a fragmentation that lasted 25 years. But it came at a bit of a sacrifice for Asian players who had their world turned, upside down, having to adapt to X as confirm, which, if you grew up there, goes against every cultural norm you know. Unification is convenient. Sure, if everything is the same, it's way easier to switch and adapt. But as much as it's a pain to switch between a Nintendo and an Xbox controller, that friction is where the charm is. ABXY was created to move away from single-purpose buttons and give us flexibility. And yet, it feels like we've somehow gone backwards. We have given A, B, circle, and X these universal roles, a purpose so engraved in us, they've basically become the very things they were designed to replace.